Hello, Science 9. Welcome to your first lesson in biology. We're going to start by talking about biological diversity. So I'm going to bring this screen up here, which is a really in-depth thing of outcomes. You can read through that if you'd like by just pausing the video. But let's read out these learning outcomes. By the end of today, hopefully, you'll be able to talk about diversity among species, diversity within a species, and then also discuss how diversity contributes to a species' survival, about how diversity is a good thing. So, first thing we're going to do is I'm going to have you go to the Padlet link that will be in Edpuzzle and type in the name of at least 5 living things that you can think of. Now, here's the trick though, because you're going to be able to see all of these different living things. I want you to see if you can actually increase the diversity of the classroom list in the things that you post. So try to come up with things that add to the amount of diversity within the big list. I want you to press a plus sign and make a new post for every single thing, every single species that you list here. But again, it's any living thing at all. Let's try to maximize the diversity. Go ahead. Okay, so now that you've taken a look at that Padlet, go back after kind of entering, or if you haven't already closed it, fantastic, and try to think about, like, as a group, did you get a pretty diverse list? Did you do okay? For example, and I know that you've already entered it, but do you have things like single-celled organisms on there? Do you have like amoebas, right? Or strep? Do you have things like mold on there, right? Like black mold, for example. Do you have like worms or plants, different plants on there as well, right? We could have like oak tree or something, or moss, whatever. These are all living things. Like, how diverse did you get? So interesting for you to take a look and see how your class did. So let's talk about what the definition of biological diversity is. Now we're actually getting into the thick of it. Biological diversity, it is the number and variety of organisms in an ecosystem. And biological diversity is very important for the health and survival of natural communities because it helps keep ecosystems stable. You actually want there to be a large amount of diversity in different ways. And we're going to talk about those different types of diversity. But diversity essentially always kind of helps with survival of an ecosystem or a species or whatever we're talking about. The greater the biological diversity, the greater the likelihood of survival should changes happen in the environment. Okay, you know what? Right away, think about the stock market where people say like, hey, diversify, right? That you should be invested in a large amount of stocks. And the reason is the same as biological diversity in ecosystems, that if one thing fails, if one thing dies out, like if one food supply dies out, for a species, well, then there's another one that can take that place. So the more diversity you have, the more like elastic an ecosystem is, the more it's able to bounce back from any changes that take place. Okay, so let's go ahead and watch this TED Ed on why biological diversity is important. Follow the link. So there are 3 types of biological diversity that we're going to talk about today. The first type is ecosystem diversity. The second type is species diversity. And then the third type is genetic diversity within a species. So ecosystem diversity, first of all, this is just the fact that there are many different types of living communities and ecosystems of habitats on Earth. We have many different like areas, many differences when we take a look at different ecosystems such as bogs, marshes, lakes, and forests. So what is an ecosystem? This should be a refresher. You took this in grade 7, for example. But an ecosystem is any place on Earth where living things, which we call biotic components, interact with non-living things, which we call abiotic components. That A means like non, right? So biotic, bio, living, abiotic, non-living. It is all the interacting parts of a biological community. So it's everything together, the living and the non-living things interacting together. If I take a look at species diversity, that's all the different types of organisms that live on Earth. So if I take a look, or even specifically if we're talking about an area, we could talk about the diversity of a species. A species is a group of organisms that shares similar genetic and physical characteristics. Generally, these organisms can interbreed and reproduce successfully. I feel like I maybe went a little bit too fast here. So when I talk about ecosystem diversity, I'm taking a look at all the different areas that I have, all the different ecosystems and how they are all different than other ecosystems. When I look at species diversity, I mean, I can look at it as the whole earth, or I could actually just look within an ecosystem and say, well, how much diversity do I have for all the species that are in that ecosystem? And the healthier ecosystems are going to have higher diversity, okay, more and more different species within it. And again, why that's nice, why that's good for the ecosystem is if one thing dies off, if one thing gets diseased, whatever, there's other things that can fill that place, right? They can take the place of the thing that died off. So it allows for more resilience from that ecosystem. So let's talk more about this definition of a species. Things are considered the same species if they can reproduce and their offspring is able to also reproduce successfully. So if two organisms can interbreed, reproduce, and then those the offspring itself can reproduce again successfully, then we know it's the same species. So for example, when you take a look at all the different breeds of dogs, those are all the same species. Okay, essentially all of those actually came from like wolves, right? And they can interbreed. Now, some of it, obviously, there's kind of some issues, right? So if you had, for example, a Chihuahua mating with like a Mastiff hound, the size difference is going to cause some issues. Yeah, but at the end of the day, in terms of the sperm and the egg and the offspring, it works. Okay, and it's compatible and it would have offspring as long as it could be birthed that then as a result could actually carry on that genetic code. Now, what's interesting is we actually can have some things mate and interbreed, but they don't actually end up resulting in offspring that can reproduce as well. And these are called hybrids. So organisms that are not of the same species sometimes breed together, but only in captivity. These offspring are called hybrids. Usually hybrids, especially males, are incapable of reproduction, and hybrids would not be capable of survival in the wild typically. So for example, if you take a horse and a mule, a horse and a donkey, my bad, you get a mule. And a mule cannot reproduce, okay, it can't have viable offspring, but it is born and it can do things, and yeah, you have a mule. Another great example of this is if you take a lion and a tiger and you mate it together and you get something called a liger. And you know what? Here's a video of a liger. Okay, follow the link to the video of the liger. So here's how a liger works. You take a lion, a tigress, and you get a liger, which is just this huge animal. Could it survive in the wild? No, it couldn't. That's not something that could happen, but it gets produced and it lives. If you take a tiger and a lioness, you get a tigon. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give you kind of this little thing that I want you to try out. I want you to pick a blank slide on the slideshow that's going to be in Google Classroom, and I'll probably link it here as well. And I want you to pick a hybrid species. There's a lot of them. So look up hybrids, pick one, tell me the name of it, okay? Give me a nice picture and tell me an interesting fact about it. Okay, so name, find me a picture, an interesting fact. Now be careful, there's a lot of photoshopped weird images out there. So I've seen like hawk cat, yeah, where it's like a cat's face on a hawk. That's not a real thing. Yeah, it's just that like Photoshop. That's what happened. So let's actually try to find real hybrid species, okay, and make your slide in the presentation. So everybody just pick a slide. So you just scroll down to the end, right, and then make a new slide and start yours. Tell me the name of your hybrid species, give me a nice picture, give me an interesting fact, and you're golden. Okay, so that's species and then hybrids, right? So again, how we tell the difference between what's one species and another is as long as it's able to reproduce and make viable offspring, it's the same species. Finally, the third type of diversity, so we talked about ecosystem diversity, species diversity, now we're on genetic diversity. Genetic diversity is the differences or variation amongst members of the same species. So if we take a look within a species, we want there to be more genetic variation, more genetic diversity. And these differences are at the cellular level because they're within DNA. Members of the same species are not exactly alike. Even if they look alike, there may be differences that are not visible, like maybe behavior or maybe being resistant to different diseases, right? I mean, there's so many different things. And you'd be amazed how much of stuff, we're going to talk about this later on, comes from your genetic code. Even things like your sense of humor, a lot of that actually has to do with your genetics. It's amazing how much your genetics makes you you. So we want to have lots of genetic diversity within a population. Let's just think, for example, about, and I know with COVID right now that it's an uncomfortable topic. Let's not talk specifically about COVID, but a virus, right? So if a virus goes through a population and everyone is very genetically similar, then everyone could react poorly to that virus. It could wipe out a population. But when we have variation, and I'm not necessarily talking about humans here, but anything, right? Let's talk about it as if it was oak trees. But if you have variation in the oak trees, then when a virus goes through, right, some might get killed by the virus, while others will survive because they have the genetic code to allow for that. So genetic diversity is good for survival of a species. And really, the more diversity within our genetic pool, our gene pool, the better. Okay, population. Population is defined by a group of individuals of the same species living in an area. So when I'm talking about a population, it's just like a city, right? Where you say the population of a city, it's how many individuals you have of that species, normally humans, right? When we talk about population of cities within the area, like the city. When I talk about a community, that's now taking a look at many different populations interacting together. Okay, so when several or more different populations are living in the same area and are sharing resources, we call that a community. So for example, in the picture, we have king penguins and seals, and they're hanging out, and that would actually be a community because they're relying on the same resources in order to survive, but it's actually more than one population. All right, let's watch this video talking about population, communities, ecosystems, and how the three different things kind of interact. All right, well, that's it for today. Yeah, enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.